Hello, my name is Scarlett. And this isn't a story about sibling rivalry, it's about betrayal dressed as family. My sister once screamed at me, "Don't you dare touch my baby!" Then slapped me so hard, my ears rang for days. She called me the help, right in front of everyone, like I didn't belong in the house I grew up in. But what she didn't know was that my husband was recording everything. They thought they could erase me, replace me, rewrite who I was. But when I uncovered the truth, everything shifted. Why would a sister destroy the one person who always stood by her? And why did the rest of my family let her? Let me tell you what really happened. Thanksgiving weekend had always been noisy in my family, the kind of gathering where the clatter of silverware and overlapping voices drowned out any silence. That year, late November, the house we filled was not mine, but Callista's, her grand colonial-style home in Charleston. The place looked like something out of a glossy magazine, white columns, sprawling porch, every room dressed up as if the holiday itself were on parade. I walked through the hallways carrying Eleanor, her 6-month-old daughter, who had dozed off in my arms after fussing in her crib. She was warm and soft against me, her breath puffing in little sighs that made me smile without realizing it. Holding her felt natural, almost grounding, though I couldn't ignore the weight of eyes around me. My parents moved briskly in the kitchen, offering Callista constant praise for the roasted turkey, the polished silver, the flowers in the dining room. Not a word for me, except when they asked if I could fetch more napkins or set another plate. I told myself I didn't mind. That was always my role. The youngest, the helper, the one who blended in at the edges while Callista soaked in the spotlight. But when I glanced down at Eleanor and saw her tiny hand curled around my finger, a spark of pride flickered in me. For once, maybe I mattered. It didn't last. The nursery door slammed open with a crack, and Callista stormed in like a sudden storm front. Her eyes locked on me, blazing, her chest rising and falling as if she'd caught me committing a crime. Before I could speak, her palm connected with my face. The sound was sharp, echoing off the walls. My head jerked sideways, and for a moment all I could hear was the ringing in my ears. "Don't you dare touch my baby!" she screamed. The room froze. My mother's footsteps halted outside the doorway. My father, carrying a tray of wine glasses, lingered at the threshold, but said nothing. Even Eleanor startled awake, whimpering against my chest. The sting burned hot across my cheek, but the real pain came from somewhere deeper. I looked at Callista, my sister, and I didn't see protection in her fury. I saw something cruel, something meant to put me in my place. I tried to steady my breath, rocking Eleanor gently so she wouldn't cry harder. "She was fussing," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I only picked her up so she wouldn't roll over." Callista cut me off, snatching a kitchen towel from the counter. She hurled it at my chest, the cloth crumpling against me before falling to the floor. "You're not family. You're the help." The words were louder than the slap. For a long second, no one moved. My parents' silence filled the room heavier than any shout. My father glanced away. My mother pressed her lips together, and both returned to their tasks as though nothing had happened. The humiliation seared through me. That towel might as well have been a brand pressed into my skin. I thought back to every holiday before this one. Callista glowing in her perfect dress while I fetched drinks, her voice rising in praise from our parents while mine went unnoticed. I'd told myself it was just the way families worked, that every family had its favorite child. But now, standing there with the taste of copper in my mouth and Eleanor's cries muffled against me, I realized it had never been subtle. It was deliberate. Callista stepped closer, lowering her voice into a hiss meant for me alone. "Stay away from her. Don't think you belong here." I swallowed hard, refusing to give her the satisfaction of tears. My cheek pulsed, my pride even more so, but I forced myself to turn toward the crib. Slowly, carefully, I laid Eleanor back down, adjusting the blanket so she wouldn't wake again. My hands trembled, but I kept them steady, refusing to let her see weakness. The air in the room thickened as I stood upright again. I faced Callista. I didn't speak, didn't lash out. Words would only feed her fire, and if I screamed, they would all nod and whisper about how emotional I'd always been. No, I would not hand her that victory. Instead, I met her gaze, letting silence weigh heavier than anything I could say. Inside me, something shifted. It wasn't just the humiliation. It was the fire it sparked. My cheek throbbed, but beneath the pain was a vow I hadn't yet spoken. This moment would not define me as the help. It would define the beginning of something else entirely. The sting on my cheek was nothing compared to the fire building inside me. I knew this was only the beginning. The air hadn't moved. My body was still processing the sting, but something far deeper had already taken root, resolve. Not revenge, not quite, just resolve. The moment had cracked open something inside me, and before anyone else spoke, I heard the familiar shuffle of running shoes against hardwood. Cassian. I didn't turn to look. I didn't need to. I knew that gait like I knew my own breath. He always ran in the mornings when we visited my family, as a kind of escape. Just a few miles to clear his head, come back calmer. But this time, he walked straight into a firestorm. He paused in the doorway, earbuds dangling from one hand, the other still holding his water bottle. His t-shirt clung slightly to his chest, darkened with sweat. But his eyes weren't calm. They were on me. His gaze swept across the room, registering everything in the span of a second. My flushed cheek, the towel at my feet, Eleanor now half asleep in the crib, Callista standing stiff with that all-too-familiar haughtiness, and our parents awkwardly frozen like background actors in a badly blocked play. I saw his jaw clench, the twitch that always came when he was forcing himself not to speak too soon. And still, no one moved. It was like the room forgot how to breathe. Cassian's eyes finally locked with mine, and for the first time all morning, I felt seen. My mother gave a cough, half-hearted, maybe to break the tension. My father picked up a plate and set it back down, like noise could erase what happened. Callista folded her arms, attempting to look unfazed, but the tremble at her mouth betrayed her. The slap hadn't satisfied her. It had exposed her. Cassian stepped further into the room, slowly, with the deliberate pace of someone who was calculating every breath. I wanted him to say something. I wanted him to shout, to ask what the hell had just happened. But I also feared it. Because what if he didn't take my side? What if he thought, like the others, that I was overreacting, that I had no place holding Eleanor in the first place? My hands trembled as I reached into the crib. Eleanor gave a soft sigh, her little hand clutching at my finger for a moment before falling back into sleep. I pulled the blanket up to her chest and made sure her bunny toy was within reach. Every motion was careful, measured. It was the only control I had left. Inside, my thoughts scattered. This wasn't the first time silence was used as a weapon. I remembered being 6, hiding in the hallway when Callista broke Mom's favorite vase. I got blamed because I was always underfoot. I remembered sitting through dinners where she boasted about internships she didn't earn and being told I should be more like my sister. This time, I wouldn't hand her more ammunition. Silence wouldn't mean surrender. It would be my shield. I straightened and turned to face them. Cassian's voice came low, cold. Someone explained to me what I just walked into. That sentence, simple, restrained, sliced through the room more than any scream could. Callista didn't hesitate. She was holding Olivia like she owned her, she snapped, calling Eleanor by her middle name. I don't know what got into her. Cassian didn't look at her. He just stared at me. Scarlet? I felt my throat tighten. I could have spoken, told him the whole thing. But instead, I let the truth hang in the space between us. My silence wasn't weakness. It was trust. I wanted him to see, to understand, without needing a performance from me. His eyes didn't leave mine. I saw it then, that flicker of recognition, of alignment. He believed me. Still, my heart pounded like I'd run 10 miles in the heat. My palms were slick. My jaw ached from holding it tight. Callista scoffed. I told her before, she doesn't get to just play mommy. She's not family like that. The cruelty in her voice was so casual, so conditioned. But this time, she'd said it in front of someone who mattered, someone who wouldn't pretend he didn't hear. Cassian stepped closer. You slapped her? Callista crossed her arms. Don't be dramatic. I reacted. She crossed a boundary. He didn't reply. Not to her. To me, he said, Are you all right? I nodded, too quickly, and hated myself for it. The room stayed still. Mom finally spoke, her voice thin. Maybe we should all take a moment. Emotions are high. It's the holidays. I turned toward her, eyes narrowing. You stood right there, I said quietly. You watched it happen. She looked away. That was when I knew. I could never rely on them. Not for protection, not for fairness, not even for basic decency. But Cassian, he had seen it all. And he hadn't walked away. As we stood in the nursery, Eleanor asleep behind us, I felt the ground beneath my feet shift just a little. I wasn't alone anymore. Someone had witnessed the line that had been crossed, and maybe, just maybe, that meant the war had finally begun. Cassian's voice cut through the tension, and for the first time, I felt the balance in the house begin to shift. I woke before dawn, the house plunged in the kind of quiet that presses against your bones. The bruise on my cheek was still tender, but my thoughts raced. Cassian's words from the night before lingered. Someone explained to me what I just walked into. They marked a turning point. I lay in the guest room, Callista's guest room, where I often slept when family visits made the house too small for me to feel contained. I was restless, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet as I slipped out of bed. I carried Eleanor across the hall, her breath hitching awake, soft and trusting against my chest, and placed her in her crib. The pale morning light stretched across her blankets. I studied her small face. For a moment, I felt lighter, as though Cassian's belief had lifted some weight from my ribs. But daylight always demands more. Later, after putting Eleanor down, I moved through the hallway leading up to the formal rooms of the house, rooms that once felt like they told stories, our stories. The fireplace, the mahogany console table, the soft rug that muffled my footsteps. The walls were lined with family portraits, generations of smiles, eyes fixed on moments meant to be remembered forever. My own childhood face shimmered in golden frames, birthday parties, vacations, baptisms. Then, as I stepped further, I realized something was wrong. Several frames were new. Different group photos replaced old ones. My face was gone. Not cropped subtlety, deleted. A photo from when Mom held me at my first Christmas tree, me wearing a red coat, cradling a plush bear, had been replaced with nothing more than a snapshot of Callista and Eleanor, empty space where I once stood. A family portrait at Easter where I used to stand between my sisters, gone. Entire rows of images showed siblings, parents, aunts and uncles, but no me. My breath caught. The glass on one frame was cool under my palm, but the cold burned more than the tactile chill. I touched where my reflection might have been, imagined a silhouette that was no longer there. My mind flooded with memories I'd almost forgotten, of praise for Callista's school achievements, while mine were barely acknowledged, of teachers asking, "Where's Scarlett?" when she received awards, of praise for Callista's dresses, Callista's charm, Callista's manners, almost nothing for me except quiet compliments when everyone else had stopped talking. I turned, startled by Callista's voice behind me. She held a wine glass, half full, the color dark against the dim hallway light. Her posture was casual, but there was something calculated in her calm. "See, Scarlett? You never belonged here. You're the help, not family," she said, voice silky, rehearsed cruelty curling around every word. I felt betrayal sharpen inside me, like glass sliding beneath skin. My vision blurred, but I forced clarity. I wouldn't cry. I wouldn't give her that. "Is that meant to hurt me?" I asked, voice low. Her lips curved in a sadistic smile. "Maybe it's meant to remind you where you are." She lifted her glass, swaying just a bit. "You should be honored to hold Eleanor, at least." I swallowed back something raw. Anger, grief, recognition of all the years I'd played a part no one seemed to value. But I paused, not because I didn't want to fight back, but because I realized that fight couldn't be loud or impulsive. It needed strategy. My hands gripped the edge of a nearby table. Eleanor's small crib mobile tinkled somewhere upstairs, somewhere quiet. The sound was a tether. I remembered Cassian's eyes, the first person in a long time who didn't look away. That memory steadied me. "I won't pretend I'm grateful for a replaced photo," I said, voice measured. "I won't pretend that erasure hasn't hurt," Callista scoffed. Oh, you always make everything about yourself. Is that what you see? I asked. Because what I see is a wall full of images that refuse to let me belong. But I also see shadows where truth could fit if someone would let it. Callista's face curled in disgust. You think you deserve this? She gestured at the frames. This home? The temperature in the hallway dropped, not because of the February draft, but because something invisible shifted. I turned toward the end of the hallway. My bedroom door stood ajar. The light from outside streamed in, painting lines across the carpet. I felt Eleanor stir in my arms, her eyelids fluttered. My throat tightened, anger pooled there, yes, but also clarity. I would let this moment change something. I put Eleanor down gently, brushing hair away from her forehead. The mobile above her crib swung faintly. I stepped back, breathing in the faint scent of old paint and wood polish, threaded with Eleanor's baby lotion. I didn't shout. I didn't break anything. I didn't raise my voice. I just held myself upright, and in that posture was my resistance. Callista's heels clicked behind me, the sound sharp. You'll apologize for this, I said, voice steady enough to carry down the hall. Not because you want to, but because you must. Her laugh was quiet, brittle. You assume too much, sister. I didn't reply. I turned away. I pushed open my door, letting it shut softly behind me. Her words echoed in my head, but instead of breaking me, they carved a promise. I would not stay silent forever. Sunlight filtered softly through the lace curtains when I woke. The morning air was pale and hushed, thick with that fragile stillness that comes only after a storm. I lay on my back for a moment, staring at the ceiling, feeling the faint thrum of the house beneath me, the hum of old pipes, the shifting wood, the small sounds that belonged to a place that remembered too much. The bruise on my cheek had dulled to a faint shadow, but every time the light touched it, I felt the echo of yesterday's pain. It wasn't only the ache in my skin, it was the ache in my chest, where Callista's words and the vanishing photographs had left their mark. Beside me, Cassian stirred. His breathing was steady, not the rhythm of sleep, but the rhythm of thought. He had been awake too, though silent, waiting for me to move first. He always gave me that space. When I finally turned my head, he was already watching. He didn't rush to speak, not at first. Instead, he reached across the quilt and touched my cheek with his fingertips, gentle, unmoving, as though he wanted me to know that someone still saw me. His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. Are you going to let this go? There was no accusation, no demand, only concern, and underneath it, something fiercer. Loyalty. My throat tightened. I don't know. The words fell small into the room, almost fragile. I'm so tired, but I can't pretend it never happened, not anymore. Cassian nodded slowly, his dark eyes soft. You don't have to pretend, not with me. In the crib across the room, Eleanor stirred, her whimpers breaking the silence. I slipped from bed, wrapping a cardigan around my shoulders as I lifted her into my arms. Her body was warm, her tiny breaths uneven. I swayed gently, whispering nothing words into her hair until her cries softened into the steady rhythm of sleep again. The nursery smelled faintly of baby lotion and old wood, the mobile above her crib spinning lazily with soft pastel animals. Sitting on the floor with her against me, I wondered if this quiet act of being the one she trusted, was a kind of justice all its own. Maybe the proof of who I was lived in this moment, in the steadiness of being her comfort, her anchor. When Eleanor's breaths evened, Cassian appeared in the doorway. He crossed the room quietly, sitting beside me on the rug. I leaned into him for a heartbeat before pulling back. I'm going to the attic, I said finally, my voice low. There's something I need. His brow lifted, wariness flickering in his expression. What are you looking for? Proof, I whispered. Proof of who I was, who I still am. The attic stairs creaked beneath our feet, each step groaning like it remembered decades of secrets. The air grew cooler as we climbed, carrying the faint smell of cedar and dust. Boxes were stacked high, trunks resting in corners like abandoned storytellers. Light spilled through a small round window, cutting into the dimness in long golden beams that danced with drifting motes. I knelt in front of a heavy wooden trunk, my grandmother's old chest. I remembered it once held holiday linens, embroidered tablecloths, lace napkins that only came out at Christmas. Now it held the weight of years. When I lifted the lid, the scent of old paper rushed up. Inside were albums stacked unevenly, corners bent, covers fraying. My hands shook as I sifted through them. Christmas photos. Callista in her perfect red dress, front and center, Eleanor's first holiday perched in her lap, Mom and Dad smiling proudly. I kept flipping, heart pounding with each turn of a page. Then I found them. The photos of me, hidden behind newer albums, tucked in the back where nobody would bother to look. There I was, playing in the snow, cheeks flushed with cold. My birthday party, pink balloons sagging in the background as I grinned at the cake. A recital, my hair tied in ribbons, bow clutched awkwardly in my hand. The edges were faded, the colors muted. But I was there. Proof that once I had been visible. Proof that once I was loved too. But the hiding spoke louder than the images themselves. My photos were not displayed on mantels, not framed in the living room. They had been tucked away, slowly replaced by Callista's curated legacy. I felt a pang deep in my chest, not just grief, but something sharper. The realization that erasure doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly, photo by photo, frame by frame. I pressed one picture to my chest, a snapshot of me as a child, freckles scattered across my face, porcelain doll earrings swinging as I laughed. For a moment, I felt both grief and pride. If they had tried to erase me, it meant I had been there. If they had hidden me, it meant they still remembered me, even if only to tuck me out of sight. Cassian's footsteps creaked closer. He crouched beside me, his hand resting on my shoulder. "You weren't gone from their hearts," he said softly, "just from their frames." My throat burned as I whispered, "When they erase the child I used to be, what else will disappear?" His grip on my shoulder tightened, steady, grounding. "Not your truth," he said. "Not with me." I closed the trunk gently, like sealing away something fragile. I slipped the photograph into my coat pocket. It wasn't much, but it was mine. My anchor, proof that I had existed, not just as Callista's shadow, but as myself. We descended the attic stairs together, our footsteps careful in the old hallway with its peeling wallpaper and faded portraits. The house seemed to shift around me, no longer quite as suffocating. Downstairs, I caught the scent of rosemary and charred edges drifting from the kitchen. Plates clinked as dinner was cleared away. Callista passed me in the hallway, her heels clicking softly. She paused, eyes narrowing, suspicion flickering across her perfect face. She didn't speak. Neither did I. I kept walking. Past the dining room where Mom and Dad sat, their gazes sliding away from me the way they always had whenever Callista swept by. Past the family room, its mantel lined with photos where her smile reigned. I stopped only at Eleanor's nursery, leaned against the doorframe, watching her small body rise and fall in sleep, her trust in me absolute. The words slipped from my lips in a whisper meant only for the darkened hall. If they've written me out of their story, maybe it's time I write my own. Cassian's presence behind me was quiet but unshakable. For the first time, I felt the shift inside me. Not just anger, not just grief, but resolve. The house felt suddenly too small for Callista's control, too fragile to contain the truth I carried. With the photograph pressed against my heart, I knew I was no longer simply surviving. I was preparing. Morning light had barely settled into the nursery when Eleanor's cries broke the silence again. The sun, a muted orange, slanted through the lace curtains, dust motes spinning like restless dancers in the air above her crib. The sound of her wails filled the room, sharp and insistent, echoing in the stillness of the house. I stood in the doorway, my body tense, watching Callista pace back and forth. She held Eleanor's blanket in her hands, twisting the fabric nervously between her fingers. Every few steps she leaned down over the crib, murmuring hollow reassurances, patting Eleanor's chest with distracted hands. But each touch only made Eleanor turn her face away, her features scrunching tighter, her arms flailing wildly. Her tiny body rejected every gesture, as though she instinctively knew something that no one else wanted to admit. Quietly, I stepped forward, the floorboards soft beneath my bare feet. I reached into the crib and lifted Eleanor into my arms. Her back was stiff, her cries sharp, her little fists still clenched. I pressed her against my chest, rocking her gently, breathing slowly so she could feel my steadiness. Almost immediately, her cries softened into whimpers, then into quiet hiccups. Her rigid body loosened, her fists uncurled, her breaths deepened. It was such a small moment, an infant's trust, but it felt like a sunrise cracking open a long, endless night. I looked across the crib at Callista. Her eyes betrayed everything. Surprise first, then a flash of something colder, and then something darker still. The bond between Eleanor and me was undeniable, and Callista knew it. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She lifted her wine glass, half empty, though it was barely past mid-morning, and took a slow sip. Her voice slid across the room, smooth and sharp all at once. "Of course," she said, her tone dripping with a false sweetness. "She only stops for you." The words were meant to sting, and they did. My heart pounded so loudly I thought everyone could hear it. Mom and Dad sat nearby, their eyes flicking nervously between us, but their mouths remained closed. The silence stretched, loud and suffocating, as if the walls themselves were leaning closer to listen. In that silence, I felt the burn, not only from Callista's barb, but from the recognition that this moment was about more than Eleanor. This was about every echo of my past, every time I'd been told to lower my voice, to be helpful but never noticed, to shrink into the background so that Callista could shine. It was about being told in 1,000 subtle ways that I was not like her, and therefore not deserving of the same love. I held Eleanor closer, breathing in the faint scent of her shampoo, soft, powdery, grounding. Her tiny warmth against me steadied my hands, steadied my heart. And for the first time, I realized that love, real love, steady and unglamorous, was its own kind of weapon, quiet, sharp, unyielding. Later that evening, I moved silently past the kitchen and stopped short when I heard voices. Callista's voice, low, brittle, hissing through clenched teeth. I pressed myself against the doorframe, my body hidden in shadow, and listened. "She'll replace me," Callista said, her tone thick with venom. "I can see it. My own baby prefers her." The words landed like a blade, sharper than any slap. My back pressed hard against the cold tile of the hallway. My palms were slick with sweat. My pulse thundered in my throat. Part of me wanted to burst into the room, to accuse her, to shout everything I'd been holding in. But instead, I froze, letting the words sink into me. And in that stillness, I understood something essential. The fight was no longer just between Callista and me. It wasn't only about sisters. It was about truth versus performance, love versus control, visibility versus erasure. If I responded in anger now, I would feed the monster she had built. What I needed was steadiness, proof, patience. As she spoke, Cassian turned slightly and caught sight of me in the doorway. Our eyes locked. He didn't call out my presence, didn't betray me, but in his gaze, I saw it. Recognition, solidarity, quiet but unshakable. That night, dinner was subdued. The air felt heavier than the rosemary chicken cooling on our plates. Eleanor had fallen asleep in Cassian's arms, her little head tucked under his chin. Callista sat across from me, her silence more telling than words. She poked at her food, her composure cracked in small fissures around the edges. My parents sat stiffly, chewing with downcast eyes, as if they were gnawing on old regrets rather than bread. I reached into my pocket beneath the table and pressed my fingers against the photograph hidden there, the one I had pulled from the attic. A picture of me as a child, freckles bright, grin wide, earrings swinging. Nobody else knew I held it, but the edges of the photo against my fingertips anchored me. Proof that I had existed. When Callista muttered under her breath about helpers knowing their place, I didn't look down the way I always had. I lifted my head, let the tension at the table stretch taut, and locked eyes with her. For a heartbeat, everyone measured me. And in Callista's gaze, for the first time, I saw it. Fear. A flicker. A tremor. Quickly buried beneath defiance. But it had been there. My voice was steady when I spoke, quiet, but firm. You know, Eleanor calms when I hold her. That's not something you can fake. The words dropped into the silence like stones in water. Callista bristled. Her wineglass trembled slightly in her hand. Everyone knows babies are fussy, she shot back. You're twisting it into something it isn't. But no one else joined her. Mom stayed silent. Dad kept his eyes on his plate. The weight in the room shifted, subtle but real. Her words hung suspended, unanswered, her fear still thick in the air. After dinner, I carried Eleanor upstairs and tucked her into her crib. The dim lamplight painted the room in soft amber. I kissed her forehead, lingering, inhaling the promise of her skin, the trust in her stillness. She drifted into sleep, eyelids heavy, lips twitching faintly in dreams. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her breathe, then slipped out before Callista could enter with more words to poison the air. In the hallway, I pressed the photograph to my chest. The paper edges bit faintly into my skin, a reminder of what had been hidden but not erased. And I told myself, if she wants a war over love, then love will be my weapon. Because now her fear of being replaced had surfaced into daylight, and I had no intention of giving her peace from it. The silence that rolled in after dinner hung heavier than the gravy that still clung to the roast pan. It wasn't the soft kind of silence that brings relief after a meal well shared. No, it was the kind of silence that carried weight, thick and pressing, leaving no room to breathe. I pushed my chair back slowly, the wooden legs scraping against the polished floor, in a sound that seemed to split the stillness. My hands rested briefly on the arms of the chair before I rose, steadying myself. Across from me, Cassian sat with Eleanor curled in his arms. She had drifted into sleep, her tiny breaths soft, her cheeks warm and flushed with the comfort of being near him. The faint, sweet scent of her baby shampoo clung to the air around us. From the kitchen came the lingering smell of rosemary and thyme, the remnants of the roast, of potatoes mashed until smooth, of carrots glazed in honey. But threaded through those domestic scents was something sharper, the metallic tang of tension. It clung to the room as surely as the candle smoke curling toward the ceiling. I replayed the moment from earlier in the day. Callista setting her wine glass down with delicate precision, as though the crystal itself were her armor. Her lips had moved in a whisper, words meant for someone else, but her eyes had darted toward me before skimming away. I'd caught Mom's sharp glare when Callista spoke, the way Dad shifted in his chair, as though his body might betray the unease he never put into words. Everyone knew something had cracked beneath the polished surface. Nobody, though, dared to pick up the shards. I looked down at my own place setting, my plate, scraped clean, my silverware, aligned perfectly on the linen napkin, but the small folded place card in front of me was still blank. No name in elegant script, no careful lettering the way Callista's bore hers. Mine was left unfinished or forgotten. Or perhaps it wasn't a mistake at all. Perhaps it was intentional, a subtle reminder that I was never meant to be fully seen at this table. The message was loud, even without words. Cassian leaned closer across the table. His voice was low, firm, but gentle, a quiet shield against the weight pressing in from all sides. "Ignore them," he murmured. Eleanor stirred faintly in his lap, her lips parting with a small sigh. He held her tighter, protective even in such a simple movement. His presence was the first warmth in a cold room. I let that warmth steady me. Callista's voice cut through the quiet. "Scarlett, can you pass the mashed potatoes?" Her tone was smooth, polite enough for the family gathered around us. But beneath the surface, I heard it. The mockery, the expectation that I would obey, that I would play my role. I picked up the serving bowl, heavy and warm, and passed it across the table. As I did, my arm brushed against Cassian's. Our fingers touched for the briefest second. It was nothing in the eyes of anyone else, but for me, that moment mattered. It reminded me that I was more than the role I had been forced to carry. Someone saw me, not as Callista's shadow, not as an afterthought, but as myself. Laughter rose suddenly from the cousins at the far end of the table. They chuckled at a joke Callista had told, something about spoiled baby food, delivered with her trademark flair. Several of them turned their eyes toward me, smirks playing at their mouths, as though daring me to join in. To perform my part, to laugh along, I didn't. My lips stayed pressed together, my eyes steady, my heart fluttered in my chest, half from restraint, half from rage. When the meal finally wound down, the sun was already dipping low, its light spilling through the tall dining room windows in long, heavy beams. Shadows stretched across the table, cutting the room into stripes of fading gold and encroaching gray. I stood deliberately, slower than usual, gathering my plate. I wiped the crumbs from the linen, stacking dishes with measured care. Cassian moved as though to help, but I shook my head gently. "I've got this," I said quietly. He met my gaze, and gratitude flickered in his eyes. A subtle exchange, but one I carried like armor. Callista's stare followed me. Her posture stiffened as she watched me move about the table, her silence sharp enough to slice through the air. Mom stood in the kitchen aisle, her body tense, her face unreadable, as though she might intervene. But she didn't. As always, her silence allowed Callista's dominance to go unchecked. And then, softly, but with deliberate cruelty, Callista spoke. "You know your place, right?" The words were small, almost whispered, but they cut deeper than if she had shouted. They were meant for me alone. I stopped, my hand still resting on the rim of the serving bowl. I felt Eleanor's breathing somewhere upstairs in the house, steady and trusting. I thought of the photograph hidden in my pocket, the one I had rescued from the attic. Proof of a younger me who had once been visible. Proof that I had not always been erased. I lifted my chin, forcing myself to meet her gaze. "Maybe I don't," I said evenly, my voice low but clear, controlled. "Maybe I deserve more than being just a shadow." A flush crept across Callista's face. It was rare to see her composure slip, but in that moment, it did. For once, she looked stunned, as though she hadn't expected me to answer back, hadn't expected her words to sting her more than they stung me. Mom cleared her throat, her voice tentative. "Please," she said, "let's not make this a scene." "I'm not making a scene," I replied, my tone steady. "I'm just standing up for something real." I placed the bowl on the counter, wiped my hands on a towel. My eyes didn't waver. I won't always be invisible here. Under the table, Cassian reached across and rested his hand over mine, his touch grounding. Eleanor stirred faintly in his arms, her tiny sigh breaking the silence like a fragile bell. Callista stared at me from across the room, her chest rising and falling too quickly. For a moment, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Recognition, maybe even fear. Or maybe it was the dawning realization that her control wasn't as absolute as she believed. We left the table soon after, Cassian carrying Eleanor upstairs, her head tucked against his shoulder. I followed more slowly, each step deliberate, the floorboards creaking beneath my weight. At the top of the stairs, I paused, glancing back over my shoulder. The dining room was empty now. The plates had been cleared, the candles extinguished, the voices vanished into silence. All that remained was the faint smell of herbs and the echo of a moment that had shifted everything. In the window pane, I caught my reflection. The bruise on my cheek was fading now, no longer angry red, but a muted shadow. My eyes burned fierce, alive with something that hadn't been there before. If Callista wanted to test the boundaries of power, I thought, then I was done waiting. This time, I wouldn't retreat. The warning I offered the previous night followed me into sleep and into morning. But sleep gave way to sharp sensations. Every message buzzed, every look felt loaded. Light streamed in through the kitchen window. Mom was humming something soft while she poured coffee. Cassian sat beside me at the table, stirring sugar into his cup. Eleanor wiggled in his arms, drowsy but content. Outside, cars came and went. Life was moving. So was trouble. I set down the mug I didn't finish, the stain on the tablecloth, a remnant from yesterday's dinner, still visible. It felt symbolic, imperfection everywhere. Mom looked at me, then away. Callista passed behind, brush of her perfume like a warning. "You look tired," she said, voice cool. I nodded. I hadn't checked my phone yet. Then the first text came. "Saw something at market today. You okay?" Then, "People are talking." My heart simmered. I felt seen, but under the wrong light. I drove to the grocery store mid-morning because someone had to buy milk because I needed air. The parking lot was nearly full. Faces I recognized, neighbors, parents of friends, looked away when our paths crossed. A woman I once greeted cheerfully dropped her smile. A man at the checkout held the door for Callista, but left it barely ajar for me. The small ways people judged, the silent seconds of avoidance, they gutted me more than her words ever had. At the counter, an elderly cashier asked if I was all right. I forced a smile. "Just tired," I said. The concern in her eyes made me ache. I paid and left, pushing through sliding doors as the automatic hum whispered behind me. That same afternoon, at Callista's house, her whisper campaign unfurled like steam. I heard her explaining to Aunt June, "Scarlett is unstable. She gets moody. She's always been jealous." I knew because I passed by the porch, her voice delicate and poisonous. I froze. Aunt June nodded slowly. I felt my name in others' lips, as though it were a lie I inspired. When I got inside, Callista noticed me. Her posture changed. She said, "Oh, you didn't sign in?" referring to a guest book that hadn't applied to me. Laughter drifted. My anger rose, not loud fury, quiet, but intense. I stood under the chandelier in the foyer. Light caught the crystal drops. I felt the weight of eyes drawn to me. I swallowed. "If rumors are what you want," I said, voice calm but resonant, "then I'll let truth carry my stories instead." There was no shouting. More pressure, a hush pressed into every ear. Callista's face flickered. "You think you're so clever," she snapped. She walked past me, shoulder brushing mine. Imperceptibly, but enough. I stepped forward. I am clever enough to know when guilt hides behind grace. The room smelled of soup simmering upstairs, and the murmur of voices tapered. I looked around, people watching, some sympathetic, others curious, many avoiding. Cassian appeared then, quietly from behind. He placed a hand on my back, no loud declarations, just steady support. I felt steadied, anchored. It wasn't about proving her wrong to everyone anymore. It was about proving something to myself. Outside, night began pulling shadows into corners. I walked to the porch, breathing in damp air. The lights from the house glowed behind me. Under their warmth, I thought, I'm done being small. I closed the front door, the click sharp. I pocketed the photo from the attic, the one whose edges had almost disintegrated. It was fragile, but it was truth. I held it there, pressed to my side, as I walked into the growing darkness. The storm had broken, but for the first time, I wasn't running from it. I was preparing to strike back. Morning light filtered through sheer curtains, painting the living room gold. I stood by the front window, watching cars pull into Callista's driveway. Relatives arriving, their faces polite, unaware that truth would walk in like a storm. Cassian came up behind me, holding Eleanor. He paused, offering coffee in his hand. I accepted, trying to steady my heart. Today was the gathering, seen by many as family business. For me, it was truth's moment. Minutes later, the house filled with chatter. Uncle Marcus greeted Aunt June. Cousins laughed with the children. Callista, dressed in pristine blue, looked every bit confident. Smile practiced. My parents sat solemnly at the far end of the long dining table. Candles flickered. Eleanor cooed softly, held by Cassian. I inhaled the scent of pine wreaths and roasting turkey. It felt strange, familiar and foreign all at once. My hands trembled slightly, but I kept them hidden. On the mantel behind me were the framed photos, some of my own face from my childhood. Ones I rescued, photographed, hidden. Today I would reveal them, one by one, proof I existed. The room quieted when I cleared my throat. "Thank you all for coming," I began. My voice sounded flat to me, but I forced it steady. "I asked for this meeting so we could share something important." Callista's eyes narrowed, but she didn't interrupt. I placed a folder on the table. Inside, texts, voice messages, screenshots, evidence I collected over weeks, neighbors texting, friends whispering, recordings of conversations where Callista admitted to trying to damage my reputation. I pulled out one message from Aunt June. She acts unstable when no one's watching. Then a recording from Callista's own phone. I'll destroy her reputation before she destroys me. Gasps rippled around the room. Mom dropped her unopened slice of pie. Dad's face went pale. Callista's glass rattled in her hand. Eleanor wrinkled her brow in Cassian's arms, sensing tension, though too small to understand context. Callista opened her mouth. That's taken out of context. I stopped her. Is it out of context to hear your voice saying what you meant? I asked. The room froze. I laid a photo on the table. Me at age 8, at the Christmas pageant, smiling huge in a red coat. Someone put this back here, I said, pointing, because some portraits were changed. Eyes flicked to the wall. I felt vindication, as though I'd breathed in something clean after being held underwater too long. Her lips curled defensively. You always spin things, Callista said. You see drama where there isn't any. Aunt June shifted. Cousin Marisol looked away. Dad cleared his throat. This behavior feels beyond petty, he said finally. I want to understand, Callista. Why? His voice shook, not elegant, but charged. Callista swallowed. Her face faltered. She began, then stopped. She looked at my mother. My mother's eyes were moist. I saw regret, but also fear. I didn't say more, not yet. The room's weight pressed down. It was a reckoning. Not loud, sharp, enough. Callista's mask slipped. She defended herself with excuses about stress, motherhood, critics, but nobody nodded. Her words sounded thin. The lies she told in calm tones recoiled around her. Cassian stood, gently holding Eleanor so I could stand too. I looked across at Callista, saw guilt or maybe dull surprise that someone had brought her world into light. I said, I live in the shadows of your perfection. I've watched you shine while being told to stay behind. Stay quiet. Today, that ends. Her voice shook. You're wrong. Everyone can see you're upset. She glanced around, disbelief in her eyes. You think I would rewrite memories? That I would hide you? She tried to anchor herself in denial. Relatives whispered, I never noticed. We thought Scarlett just didn't care to be in the photos. This is hurtful. Aunt June rose. Enough. Her voice, though soft, cut through. You can't dismiss this. We've all heard enough. My mother's hand trembled on the table. I'm sorry, she said to me, to the room. I was wrong. My father followed. I didn't see what you went through. Callista's face crumpled. She stood abruptly. This isn't over, she said, voice tight. Then she turned and left the room. The air felt hollow after she closed the door. Eleanor stirred. Cassian put her down. I exhaled deeply. Release mingled with ache. I had won, but the cost was heavy. I stood there holding the folder, looking at faces that had avoided me. Some sad, some ashamed, most quiet. The photos on the wall glowed in lamplight, showing me where I belonged. I touched the frame of that old Christmas portrait. A surge of warmth, of vindication, and of sorrow for years lost. Her footsteps echoed down the hallway, but for the first time, she walked it alone. Morning sunlight crept into my room, soft and pale, as though apologizing for last night's storms. I stood by the window, watching neighbors go about their day, some whispering as their cars passed, others turning to glance at my house. There was a pause in the air, heavy like a held breath. But today, something felt lighter. Today, I was stepping into a different kind of daylight. The gathering ended in a silence that was thick but not broken by excuses. Callista had left, leaving echoes of her footsteps behind, and there was nothing more to defend. My parents remained at the table, their faces tired, eyes wetted with what I believed was regret. Cassian carried Eleanor to me. Her small fingers curled around mine when I reached out. I held her close and felt the truth settle in my palms. Power shifted quietly in that room. Truth exposed what had been looking for light. I thought, Vindication isn't joy, it's heavy, like carrying justice in trembling hands. I looked at the framed photo on the wall, my red coat at Christmas, my shy smile, and realized it had never left me, even when others tried to erase it. Word of what I had shown circulated quickly. By midday, calls from friends and old classmates who had kept their distance were softer now, tinged with apology. At the mailbox, I found notes tied onto our gate, a few kind words, some stories shared by people who had only glimpsed the pain I carried. The garden smelled of freshly cut grass. The air breathed differently. Callista became a ghost in our circles. Invitations that once sent her glowing tweets or public praise now went out without her. Friends withdrew, some avoiding sight of her house. Mom didn't attend the neighborhood luncheon. At church, people shifted pews when they saw her. I saw her from afar one Sunday, looking smaller than she ever let on. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grief for what was lost. But I also felt the cool relief of truth holding its ground. Rumors floated that Cassian and Callista were having serious conversations. I heard from my brother that she blamed me for ruining family reputation, but I knew her punishment wasn't because of me. It was because the image she had built had nowhere to hide. The mirror shattered, and she could no longer face it without seeing the cracks. Healing was slow. Cassian and I began small routines. We took Eleanor to the park in the late afternoons, walked past my old neighbors who finally greeted me. I stopped shrinking when someone said hello. In the grocery, someone smiled. At the post office, I held my head higher. The world seemed to reflect back a version of me that was no longer just the help. One afternoon, I visited Eleanor in her room. She looked up at me, eyes bright, her face lighting in recognition. She reached for me silently, no words yet, no fear. Her trust untouched by all the lies. I kissed her forehead, smelled her soft hair. At that moment, I felt something true. Love could rebuild parts of us even after betrayal. I still carry the sting of every erased photo, every whispered lie. The wound doesn't forget. But I no longer allow it to define me. I woke up this morning, bruised but resolute. I am done being invisible. I am family, and I choose what that means. Walking into the sunlight beside Cassian, I felt something shift inside. An ache softened, but promise awake. Family isn't the ones who wound you. It's the ones who stand when the world tries to erase you. And I was finally ready to stand tall. Sometimes the deepest scars are not the ones left on our skin, but the ones carved by the people who were supposed to love us most. This story isn't just about betrayal. It's about reclaiming dignity, standing tall after being pushed down, and learning that family isn't always blood, but who chooses to stand by you when everything falls apart. Have you ever had to walk away from someone who once meant everything? Or found strength in places you never expected? If this story struck a chord, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more real, emotional, and powerful revenge stories that uncover what truly lies behind closed doors.